Good morning, everybody. My name is Charles Peru, the Director of Carbon Projects here at Verst Carbon. And this is the fifth sessions, as Surya mentioned. Before we get to this session, I would like to have my colleagues who will be supporting me in today's webinar to also introduce themselves. Then we get some context into what we are doing and why we're doing it, and then we can kick off. So now I'll start off with Zach, Violet, Ziana, and Sandra. Zach, over to you. Introductions.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Zakaria Mwangi. I'm a Carbon Associate here at Verst Carbon, and I'll be supporting you in this sort of webinar today. So looking forward to learning more on this. Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Hello everyone, my name is Violet Kirote. I also work here at Verst Carbon as a carbon associate for energy projects, and I'll also be engaging with you in the chat section. Looking forward to the session. Happy learning.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ziana Chelimo. I'm a carbon associate also at Verst Carbon, and I will be answering your questions together with my colleagues in the Q&A and chat section. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everybody. So for the sake of today's session, and just to make sure we are fully focused, I haven't stripped my video. As most of you will know that this presentation and the accompanying materials was developed by Somerset. Origination is part of the program overseen by the Gold Standard Foundation and funded by the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. The program saw 7 project developers across the globe selected to support the gold standard in spreading the knowledge on how do you go about certifying a number of climate mitigation projects. We started off the initiative in March in a series of 5 programs, the first being the introduction to carbon market, just giving people context of what it means, what it is exactly we talk about when we're talking about carbon markets and the basis of climate mitigation. Then we had a session whereby we're looking at the specific processes of going around and registering a gold standard project, followed by a technical discussion on how do you go about developing a renewable energy carbon project. Last week, we looked at afforestation and reforestation projects, and this week we are looking at clean cooking. Now, most of you, I know you have been hearing clean cooking, e-cooking, improved cooking. So one of the key things we'll be looking at this week is to provide a distinction of what we mean by biomass cooking, improved cooking, clean cooking, e-cooking, and all the related nuances. To support me will be my colleague Zachary Nyoeke, and we shall be looking at 4 main modules. The first module is a general overview of what it means to develop a clean cooking project. The second module to be covered by my colleague Zach will be how do you go about calculating the emission reduction from a clean cooking project. Remember, for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, when we mention emissions reduction, we simply mean the carbon credits, or if you like, and in the context of the gold standard, we will be meaning verified emissions reductions in VERs. The third module will be how do we go about assessing the eligibility, applicability, and additionality of a possible clean cooking project. And lastly, we'll be looking at how we go about implementing, monitoring, and reporting the project. Now, as we kick off the first module, I want to throw in a question, and please feel free to throw in different answers. And of course, we shall be giving the answer. The question is, what do you think is the underlying purpose, objective, or premise for doing a clean cooking project? Why do we say why do we find companies developing clean cooking projects? What do you think exactly they're trying to solve? Please throw in your answers, and hopefully by the end of today's discussion, that answer will have been firmed up extensively. Now, in this module, we are going to learn about improved cookstop projects, but specifically looking at the greater context of what we mean by clean cooking projects. And we hope that by the end of this project, you'll have been able to understand what is a gold standard clean cooking project. And remember, the terminologies improved cookstop and clean cooking will be used interchangeably, but by the end of today's session, you'll be able to distinguish the different nuances between improved cookstove projects and clean cooking projects, and of course, e-cooking projects or electric cooking projects. Second objective, and we hope that you'll understand, is recognize the different kinds of clean cooking projects, learn what the steps are in implementing clean cooking projects, and of course, understand the different and approved methodologies for you to do a clean cooking carbon project. And last but not least is we hope that by the end of today's session, you'll be able to acknowledge the importance of the contributions of the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, remember that the gold standards one registered is very, very keen on SDG targets. That said, as we covered in the first topic back then in March, we noted that for you to do a climate mitigation project under the gold standard, you have to make sure that you are covering at least 3 SDG targets, one being 13 for the climate mitigation, and of course any other 2. And of course, the gold standard has published or developed what we call an SDG impact assessment tool that will allow you to be able to quantify the mitigation. As we have been doing since the beginning of our webinar, we are going to be following the journey of a fictional carbon project developer. In this case, we shall be calling that developer Eco Africa. So in this context, Eco Africa has an idea to develop a gold standard clean cooking project, and they want to learn about the options within the gold standard registry. Eco Africa is an organization based, of course, let's say in Kenya or Senegal or the DRC, and they see a need for a clean cooking project in their country because a number of the rural communities cook in inefficient 3-stone fires, burning non-renewable biomass, and the urban houses are cooking on charcoal stoves. In this case, Eco Africa wants to learn about improved cook stoves or clean cooking and how they can implement them to reduce CO2 emissions and improve the lives of the end users. So whenever you hear us talking about Eco Africa, please don't be confused. It's simply a fictional developer we're using for the purposes of instruction. What is an improved cookstove project, or if you like, a clean cooking project within the gold standard registry? Just a question. I don't know if you guys have been able to throw in some of your answers around it to just see what is your general understanding of a clean cooking project. Now, in the context of our developer, Eco Africa inquires about clean cooking projects with local social enterprises, NGOs, women groups, and local governments. They're trying to find out the following. And for example, what is it that they're going to be achieving from the deployment of a clean cooking project? And of course, for them, what is more important is to understand what is the current scenarios within the different communities. Now, if you have been able to put in some answers in the comment section, one of the key things that you look at Clean Cookstove will be, of course, most of you will be thinking around, for example, a number of households have been used to using the 3-stone fires, and they're using firewood. And of course, one of the resultant effects is that there's a lot of generation of the greenhouse gases, and of course, which is not that healthy. Others will be telling you that also there's a problem to do with sustainable use of biomass for cooking energy. For example, they'll tell you that a number of households are using firewoods, and that it's very important we try to move away from the use of firewoods because presumably, whereas most firewood will be collected, they also express the concern that in some cases, there are cases whereby trees are being chopped down or harvested, like mangroves and whatnot, for the sake of providing firewood. And therefore, one will be asking themselves, overall, what is the underlying premise behind developing of clean cooking projects? Are we looking in principle at the health components, or are we looking in principle at the firewood coming from trees? Now, I'll answer that question in a moment, but just remember this. When you go back to understanding the basis of carbon markets, we mentioned that carbon markets is all about developing a climate mitigation project whose purpose is to reduce or remove greenhouse gases that are known or are the known causative agents for the increase in global temperatures. Okay, remember that climate mitigation projects are designed to reduce or remove greenhouse gases which have been known or observed to be increasing global temperatures. For context, in the case of clean cooking projects, if you go to a kitchen that is using the 3-stone firewood stove, you will notice that there's a lot of heat or there's a high temperature within the particular kitchen, whether or not the windows are open. Put aside the issue of the smoke inhalation. The heat in principle, of course, will be coming from the fire, but more importantly, will be from the greenhouse gases being generated from the burning of the firewood. And therefore, for you to make a claim that you want to do a climate mitigation project in the context of clean cooking, you have to design a project in the form of a project device that is in principle designed towards ensuring you can either reduce or remove the amount of greenhouse gases generating during the cooking process. I hope that point is very clear. Okay, we must design a project that's going to be able to reduce or remove that amount of greenhouse gases. How do you go about this? One of the easiest ways, as you can see on the screen, is by deploying what we call an improved technology that is way better compared to the baseline scenario. In this case, will be you using the 3-stone. So you must introduce a cooking technology that is going to be ensuring that the end user will be, when they're using your cooking technology or cooking apparatus, if you like, they're going to be reducing the amount of greenhouse gases being generated. In the context of the gold standard, as we shall see later on, the gold standard methodologies require that the thermal efficiency of that cooking technology be 20% for one methodology. It's called TPDD Tech. That is technology and practices for displacing decentralized cooking technologies, or 40% in the context of the current or one of the newest clean cooking methodology in the gold standard called measured and metered energy cooking devices. And I'll ask my colleagues to put the names and the links of those two methodologies in the chat section. So the key thing here, again, we must make sure is that one, we're able to design a project whose technology is going to be very efficient in the reduction of the greenhouse gases, because that is the basis of climate mitigation. And of course, because the device is going to be having a high efficiency, as you can see, over time, we shall be expecting to reduce the fuel consumption. Now, we're not just targeting households, we're also looking at institutional and commercial settings. What do I mean? If there's some restaurants in your community that have been using 3-stone for cooking, and you want to, let's say, introduce a highly efficient steam cooker that's running on, let's say, LPG in, let's say, a particular province in Senegal or Malawi, that will also be a potential clean cooking project. But of course, remember, other things to do, the additionality must be in consideration. Now, remember, it's all about reducing the amount of displacement. What do I mean in this case? Some methodologies within the gold standard allows you to develop a project whose technology can still run on firewood, on the condition that the fuel consumption, the thermal efficiency, and the greenhouse gas emissions will be considerably reduced. Okay, I think I've seen a number of cook stoves, or if you like, cooking devices that are part of Carbon project. They're still running on firewood, but the difference is in this case is before, for example, one cooking session would use, let's say, 2 kilograms of firewood, but in this case, because of the efficiency of the cook stove, it's less running on, let's say, 200 grams of firewood. So such methodologies exist within the gold standard, for example, the ones you'll be looking at, but more importantly is to say is that the methodology allows you to use cooking technologies that allows you to cook with biomass, gas, electricity, or even solar. Okay, and when I say gas, it could be LPG, it could be biogas as well. But remember, whenever you're doing a carbon project, you must be in full compliance with your host country or your country's regulations. So, for example, if your country has prohibited the use of let's say, firewood for cooking, then you will not be allowed to register your project the gold standard, even though the gold standard allows such projects, because the gold standard is respectful of host country regulations that restrict certain practices. So if your country prohibits the use of firewood, then in this case, you will not be allowed to register such a project. And remember, key thing is that you must show SDG impacts within your project beyond SDG 13. Recall I asked you the question on what do you think is the underlying premise behind the clean cooking projects. I don't know if you guys have been able to answer, but I want you to just think again, look at your first answer and think, ask yourself, are we looking at, are we trying to solve the problem of smoke inhalation health, or are we trying to solve the problem of reducing the amount of firewood, for example, being consumed within certain ecosystem? Please keep thinking deeply about it, and of course, we shall be able to get back to you. Now, most of you have been hearing concepts on renewable and non-renewable. Again, I think we covered this one in principle when you're looking at renewable energy, but in principle, when a cooking fuel is considered to be non-renewable, it simply means that it's not easily replenishable as compared to renewable. Looking back at our process, EcoAfrica is encouraged to investigate the baseline situation to see what households are currently using for their cooking needs. They will look at the technology and the fuels being used, as well as the social factors, such as time or money spent acquiring fuel and exposure to indoor air pollution. Okay? I hope that thing is very, very clear. There are a number of nuances that clean cooking projects are trying to solve. It could be the issue of health. It could be the amount of time spent in looking for the cooking fuel. It could also be the amount of resources in terms of money used in acquiring such cooking fuels. Now, as a developer, you must undertake a inquiry, and in some cases, you'll find that a large number of the households that you're looking to support are using three-stone fire stoves that is relying on wood. Now, in the studies, we'll find that some of the communities, they say they spend an hour collecting firewood, and moreover, the smoke coming from the cooking process no longer is not just hurting their respiratory system, but it's also affecting their eyes. And in some cases, they mentioned that they are using their children to go and look for firewood, be it in the morning, be it in the evening, and that is also affecting the time spent for looking for fire as opposed to, let's say, doing things like education. Now, for those in urban households, you'll realize that most people within urban households, when it comes to preparing cereals, they often want to use charcoal stoves for preparing the cereals, okay? Even though we know, for example, electric cookers can do equally same mitigation. So in this case, in the rural households, you'll find most people are using three-stone. In the urban scenarios, you'll find most people are using the inefficient charcoal stoves, which, as you know, for most of you, is always increasing in price, because most governments have started to limit or restrict or even prohibit the use of charcoal, chopping down of trees for charcoal generation for as a cooking fuel. So there's some of the nuances. As a developer, you must be able to study within your business scenario to have a very good feel of the understanding, even before you look at what are you going to be doing. So generally, cooking practices are usually found to be done within closed settings. It could be the home, it could be the restaurant, and therefore, for you as the developer, you must be able to clearly identify the inefficient baseline technologies that are being used and are resulting to the let's say, the indoor air pollution. In most cases, your baseline should have things like, for example, the significant consumption of non-renewable biomass, the use of inefficient technologies. For example, if you're using firewood or three-stone, they say the efficiency is barely 10%, for example, because there's a lot of heat loss because the way the three stones are arranged. And of course, there's the issue of household air pollution or even institutional air pollution. And of course, there's the time and money spent on fuel. These are some of the characteristics that when you're doing your baseline study, you should be able to identify as being some of the key things you must be able to resolve, even as you are now trying to develop your given project scenario. Okay, you're trying to now introduce your new cooking technology. So remember, I mentioned that when you're using firewood for the three-stone, the inefficiency is often less than 10%, even as much as barely 5%. So when you're looking at doing clean cooking projects, you must be able to target a number of components. Of course, there must be an aspect of an upgrade. The upgrade should, of course, in principle, be in the technology. Remember, like we said, climate mitigation is always about reducing or removing the amount of greenhouse gases. And therefore, for you to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in a three-stone and firewood stove setup, it simply means that you have to find a way within which you are able to reduce that, and for you to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases, then you must find a technology or develop a technology that is going to be very efficient in the consumption of the cooking fuel. I hope that point is very clear. And of course, you should also be able to document that with the reduced amount of greenhouse gases, the what you call particulate matter, the particulate matter, particularly the 2.5, has to also be reduced. These are things, studies that must be done from the innovative technology you're trying to introduce. It's not just going somewhere, designing something and deploying it. No, there must be analysis done to check the efficiency of your stove, to check the amount of particulate matter being emitted on account of using your device. And of course, remember the different characteristics you are looking for in the business scenario. We must also be able to tell a story beyond climate action. What else are you doing with respect to reducing to other SDG targets? For example, are we looking at the SDG on innovation, for example? Maybe your technology is resulting in the deployment of a cook stove or a clean cooking apparatus that, for example, is relying on bioethanol as opposed to firewood. Or, for example, it's still using firewood, but its thermal efficiency is 60%. Okay, so look at the different SDGs. It could be on technology, it could be on gender empowerment, whatever it is. You must be able to make sure that you can document it using the SDG tool given by the gold standard. Please, again, feel free to post any questions in the Q&A section or comment section, and we shall be able to respond on the same. So I go back to my original question. What is the perceived benefits of a clean cooking project? What are the perceived benefits of a clean cooking project? Please post your answer, and as you're posting your answer, provide the corresponding SDG target that speaks to the benefit of a clean cooking project. What are the benefits of a clean cooking project? Please post your answer based on understanding so far, and my colleagues will be able to correct anything that is amiss. What are the benefits of a clean cooking carbon project? Post the answer, and you can also put in bracket the corresponding or related SDG target. And also remember, my question still stands. What of all the benefits, what is the underlying principle governing or that's going to greatly affect your emissions reduction when you're looking at developing a clean cooking project? Now, as I always say, there is what you call the hierarchy of standard documents when it comes to developing any carbon project, or if you like, any climate mitigation projects within the gold standard. And whereas there are quite a number of documents, there's a certain hierarchy that must be followed. And as I said, the principles and requirements documents hold precedence over and above anything else. Within the principles and requirements, you must make sure that your project is in full compliance with the principles and requirements guidelines given by the gold standard. We shall be posting these links for those who do not have this link, but you must make sure as a developer or as a potential upcoming developer, you must make sure you're very familiar with the principles and requirements of the gold standard. You must also make sure you're very compliant and very conversant with the stakeholder requirements with respect to the processes of going about holding a stakeholder convention. Okay, there are certain guidelines being provided, and also the safeguarding principles. The gold standard is not just about climate mitigation. The gold standard is not simply all about issuing you with the so-called carbon credits. They want to know the process, the how, the why, the where of you developing that mitigation project. For example, are you, as the CEO of your carbon developing company, having fair labor practices within your offices, for example? Are you treating, for example, the women working in your company accordingly, or there's some form of discrimination, for example? Okay, so you must be able to show, even within the documentation of your project details, the adherence to safeguarding principles, not only at the project level in the community we are deploying it, but also within your company as well, because the goal is very keen on a holistic approach towards combating climate change through climate mitigation projects. Okay, and of course, as you can see there, gender equality is something that you also must make sure it is infused within your project design. Now, the other document that is also important, but this is also it depends whether or not it's applicable to your project. And this one is the one called POA, Program of Activities. You remember that you can design a project as a standalone carbon mitigation project, or it can be a group project. Okay, so for example, you'll find some company, let's say in one country, they have got 3 or 4 different cooking technologies. So for the sake of clarity, and because maybe the different technologies will be using different methodologies, they will design a program of activities that says, hey, we have designed a program of activities that's going to be using the 2 or 3 different methodologies as allowed by the gold standard. And each VPA, each voluntary project activity, okay, will be subscribing to a particular methodology and its corresponding requirements. But all of them are within our larger program of activities. So if you're going to be designing such a program, then you must make sure you are going to be in compliance with the POA requirements. But if not, then it's not going to be necessary. Things like design change and deviation depends on whether or not you're looking to have a methodology deviation. It's a very technical process. It is allowed, but you need to be very careful whenever you're doing such, because most of these methodologies are very much robust, and it could be that you need to change your program design or a design before considering changing the methodology, because most of these methodologies are pretty much robust. But if you find the need to, they provide you for cases of deviation, and of course you must be able to make sure it is approved by the auditor. The other category, it is the activity requirements, and in this case, because you are dealing with a clean cooking project, it will form under CSA, that is community services activities, okay? And of course, it has its own respective guidelines. And then the 4th category of key documents are the methodologies. And in this case, it's going to be about the energy efficiency. Remember, I mentioned this. Clean cooking projects are looking to do a number of things. But in principle, climate mitigation projects are looking to reduce greenhouse gases. And with respect to cooking practices, it comes down to the efficiency of the cooking apparatus, the efficiency of the project technology, efficiency in what? The thermal efficiency. In other words, the energy efficiency. It comes down to the energy efficiency of your cooking technology that you're going to be introducing. And because of that, then it is clustered as an energy efficiency project. It's not a renewable energy project, even if it's going to be running on solar. It's not a forestry project, even though the project is going to be resulting in the reduced amount of deforestation by design, because you're reducing the amount of firewood being consumed. It is solely focused as an energy efficiency project, and therefore all the principles governing energy efficiency project must be adhered to. Last but not least are the product requirements. The product in this case, of course, is none other than the carbon credits, if you like, or more technically, the gold standard verified emissions reduction. I hope this so far will be clear. My colleagues have put in place in the chart the 2 main gold standard methodologies, and of course, we'll also be putting links to the different standard documents within the gold standard. However, I want to quickly take a slight deep dive into some of those key documents, and in this case is the activity requirements and methodologies. Remember, as I said, you must make sure you have read through the 5 mandatory principles and requirement documents. And as a developer, you're looking at the next stage. What else can we do? Now, in this case, of course, you're looking at the methodologies, and the methodology, remember, will be anchored by the activity requirements. And in this case, for energy efficiency projects, the clean cooking projects, they're falling under what you call the community service activity requirements. And of course, the underlying principle is that they will lead to climate mitigation and or even adaptation by providing or improving access to services or resources at the household or community or institutional level. Community service projects, CSA project activities, are always designed towards improving access to certain resources at the household, community, or even the institutional level. Now, the community service activity requirements sets out necessary guidelines and requirements. So, for example, additionality. I hope you all remember additionality. The decision whether or not your project will be requiring carbon finance or otherwise. So in this case, in the context of community service activity requirements, additionality may be demonstrated as per the CSR guidelines. It provides what we call a positive list. Okay, positive list. But with certain technologies or measures are deemed automatically additional. Okay, so for example, I'll tell you that the introduction of electric cooking apparatus will be, in most cases, be part of the positive list given the country you're in. And also, if, for example, if your project is going to be generating less than about 600 verified emission reduction units, it can also be considered to be automatically additional. If your project is being developed in what you call, again, the LDCs, the least developed countries also, in most cases, it's in the positive list, and your project will be considered to be automatically additional. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned, that even though your project falls within a positive list, it behoves upon you to make sure that you're able to go further and you go further and show that you're also able to meet the other additionality requirements stipulated within the CDM tool 01. I hope by now everyone is very familiar with that. The CDM tool 01 is the go-to tool for proving additionality. Next, as a developer, you will go to the Gold Standard website and look at the different methodologies and see and try and find which one of those are applicable. As we shall see in today's session, you will find that if you're looking for, if your project technology is a cook stove project that will still be using firewood, but in a more efficient manner, then the methodology you'll be using is the one we call TPDDTEC, that is technologies and practices to displace decentralized thermal energy consumption. Okay? Technologies and practices to displace decentralized thermal energy consumption. However, if, for example, you're looking at deploying an electric kind of a cook stove, then your go-to methodology will be the measured and metered energy cooking devices, MMECD, as put by my colleagues within the chat box. Now, as a developer, you must make sure you scan through the websites and everything to make sure you look at all the most applicable and appropriate methodologies. Now, within the Gold Standard website, you will come across a webpage labeled Eligible Impact Quantification Methodologies. That is where most of the methodologies are often listed. And in the context of the Gold Standard, there are quite a number of them that are going to be listed, all of which depend, again, with the kind of mitigation activity. Remember, your mitigation activity, how you've designed it, should inform the kind of methodology you're going to be using for your clean cooking carbon projects. Don't work in reverse. Design your project, then based on the mitigation activity, go for the respective methodologies. So there are quite a number I've mentioned. There is the technologies and practices to displace decentralized thermal energy consumption. There is the Gold Standard methodology for measured and metered energy consumption devices. And this particular methodology is applicable to directly metered technologies in the project scenario. For example, we here as Verst Carbon have been able to deploy an IoT sensor for electric pressure cookers that allows us to remotely measure the amount of energy consumed by the EPC from wherever they are within our Nairobi office, but the project has been deployed far beyond our Nairobi office. Okay, so that's one of the applications of the MMCB methodology. And also the 4C, the gold standard is also aware that the other entities who have been very keen to deploy innovative methodologies. For example, we have got the comprehensive lowered emissions assessment and reporting methodology that has been co-developed by the Clean Cooking Alliance. The gold standard also has what you call the gold standard simplified methodology for clean and efficient cooktops, which follows a simplified process and is only applicable to micro-scale projects. I hope you all remember the micro-scale project. A micro-scale project is one that is generating less than 10,000 verified emissions reduction. So if your project is such, then most likely be told to use that methodology. And also, last but not least, remember that the gold standard, like any other standard, allows certain categories of CDM methodologies. So for this context, MS2G is one such methodology from the CDM that is applicable to use within the gold standard. Okay, and in this case, the MS2G methodology is looking at energy efficiency measures in thermal application for non-renewable burners. However, when it comes to picking the methodologies, you also must figure to put this in mind that whereas you're going to be doing your carbon mitigation projects to generate the carbon credits, or if you like, the verified emissions reduction, somebody has to buy them. Buyers are looking at projects that have relied on methodologies that have been found to be very, very robust in the monetary reporting and verification. Moreover, for those of you who are familiar with entities such as the ICVCM, they often tend to give a sort of analysis or technical examination of some of these methodologies to see whether or not they're designed to do verifiable climate mitigation projects. What am I saying? What I'm saying is doing a carbon project, getting a carbon credits is one thing, making sure they are sold at the best price, premium price, is another. And some of those outcomes are heavily dependent on the kind of methodologies you're using, because they will stipulate the kind of monitoring, reporting, verification approach. Okay, so when you have selected your prototype based on the given goal standard requirement, you can then look at how do you go about implementing. Now, you will realize that in most cases, you as a developer must be able to make sure that you have done extensive what you call baseline studies to make sure that you really understand the community you're trying to do. Number two, remember that because you have designed a so-called cook stove that is going to be replacing what people are using in the household, then it must speak to their needs. So for example, here in Africa, we know that our household sizes tend to be quite significant, and therefore most cases people are using large surface area kinds of cooking pots. Therefore, when you are introducing your new cooking technology or a new cook stove, you must make sure it speaks to the utility of those African household practices. For example, if most households prefer to use a cooking pot or cooking vessel whose diameter is 30 centimeters, you have to make sure then that your corresponding cooking technology is able to accommodate such kind of cooking pots. In this case, you must do what you call a KPT, that is a kitchen performance test, to make sure that indeed your cook stove is going to be a suitable replacement to what is being used in the respective household. That means you do a lot of tests in the communities. You have to do a lot of community engagement, stakeholder consultations as well. And of course, you have to make sure that the thermal efficiency of your cook stove has been verified by an independent company or laboratory, if you like, to make sure that if you're saying it is 40%, then the third-party industry test entity that can actually say, yes, indeed, this particular cook stove is indeed having a thermal efficiency of such. Okay, this is just a quick question to jog your memory. What are some of the requirements for a gold standard clean cooking project? What are some of the requirements of a gold standard cooking project? Try and remember some of the documents we have been talking about, and you remember that one, we talked about the fact that there must be an aspect of energy efficiency. For some methodologies, they want the efficiency to be as high as 40%. And also remember, you must engage your community to get the respective corresponding consent from them for you to do your carbon projects. Now, I know we have spoken much, but in case you've got any question or any clarification, please feel free to put your question in the chat box or the Q&A section, and we shall be able to respond to you. That said, allow me to stop there for now and welcome my colleague Zach to take us to the second section, which is all about how do we go about quantifying our emissions reduction. It's all about formulas and the technical approaches to how we calculate your baseline and whatnot. That said, allow me to stop talking or stop instructing and welcome Zach to take over for the second module. Zach, welcome on board.
Thanks a lot for that. Yes, so let me share my screen. Yes, I hope you can see my screen. Somebody confirm, please, that you can all see my screen before I proceed. Perfect. So, thank you so much, Charles, for sort of very detailed walkthrough in the first section. And of course, as he mentioned, is that I'm going to be taking you through a bit of some technical details on how you do some of this quantification of the emission reduction. As he mentioned, is that the key basic of how or what we mean by emission reduction is basically the carbon credits, which the sort of the value that translates directly to the carbon credits that are going to be yielded by a carbon project. So just diving into the learning objective of this section. So at the end of this section, again, we'll be looking for to ensure that at least you understand what are some of the most used, impact quantification methodologies. And of course, I think I'm sure that my colleague Charles has, walked you through some of the specific methodologies that can be used in terms of the clean cooking. And of course, I'll be doing a bit of in-depth or even using some case scenarios on how do you actually go ahead and use or utilize some of these methodologies in your project. And also, the other one would be, of course, diving through into the key specifics on how you do the calculations or the quantification of these emission reductions, and also like going about what are some of the key baseline parameters that you should consider or that are considered or looked at when you be calculating your emission reduction as well. And lastly, will be understanding some of the key project parameters that will be sort of required for you, to monitor that are necessary or that are going to assist you when you be, doing the quantification on this specific project, the clean cooking section. So if you allow me to go ahead to the details, is that yes, so I think just going to this one, I think I'm not going to go ahead into, again, the specific as well. But as I mentioned, I think I'm sure that you now have a better understanding on the key, the 5 specific methodologies that we have listed here, starting with the TPDD tech, of course, being a very and most common methodology and a gold standard. And of course, the rest, being utilized for the clean cooking specific projects. So as I mentioned, of course, each methodology, of course, has different applicability conditions and clear guidelines on when you should sort of apply each of them. So each of them, again, when it comes to the emission reduction in this specific, has different calculations on how actually you will go about calculating or quantifying your emission reductions. Therefore, it is good to understand that all of them have their unique way on how they do assess or quantify these emission reduction. Of course, I'll be taking you through some of the key specifics in each of them and some of the key nuances or differences in this key method. But of course, I won't sort of go ahead and repeat on the explanation of each of them, and we just go ahead to again sharing a bit of nuances. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, is that of course each of these methodology has been used in the previous projects, and of course having quite a share, each of them having a share in the market based on the key emission reduction or the carbon projects that have been registered under each of these methodologies. Of course, I think if you see from the graph, of course, and the numbers, you realize that each of the registry or each of the methodology has a bit of a portion on the percentage of the project actually that has been utilized or implemented under this specific methodology. And of course, you realize that, as I mentioned, is that TPDD, of course, shares or holds a very a huge percentage, which sums to almost 60%, and of course up to with a total of 912 projects in this case, showing of course has been the most implemented or used project in this case under the gold standard registry. In this case, of course, there is others as my colleague mentioned that of course. As other registries, of course, they also consider utilizing recognizing other methodologies like the CDM, that is the EMS 2G, and of course having some of the project registered under gold standard, but of course utilizing the methodology from the CDM. But of course there's some key they have like for instance they have like key requirements or guidelines on how of course you can utilize some of this methodology from the main registry like the CDM. And of course if you realize, that the MECD, that is a meter methodology, has quite slower or a bit of a smaller number in terms of the percentage of share in the carbon project register. But of course, this is a very new a new methodology. So that's why you realize, of course, there is a bit of it's being implemented in the recent days. Of course, it has been in the market not really for a long time, and of course that's why you realize that it doesn't have a lot like in terms of the percentage share in the market. But of course each of them has different applicability, of course, depending again on the project types, as I'll take you through in the next slide as well. So before we go ahead, I think I'll just put in like just low sort of a question round through. Of course, you've been able to understand some key nuances on the different methodologies and the different registries, and of course how they apply to this clean project development. And just to understand a bit of what you are at the moment, is that I would like to understand like maybe what do you think is the role of methodology when it comes to a carbon project. So like you can just think around. Of course, I think the most of this we've been able to talk about them. I'm trying to explain like how it really breaks down into the key nuances, and of course, in this context of the emission reduction calculation, what do you think is the role of methodology in this case? And of course, you can throw in your responses, and just to give you like a bit of a highlight is that of course, as I mentioned, is that it provides a basic approach, ways on how you do calculate the emission reductions with a clear and a defined pathway. Of course, I mentioned that each methodology has its own unique formulas or a method or approach how they do calculate emission reduction. Therefore, it is a key. It provides that standardized approach for each each project type on how you should go ahead and or about calculating your emission reduction of your project in this case. Just to go ahead, I think again, as I'll just kick ahead a bit of a recap on what my colleague mentioned, is that when we will be doing the calculation of the emission reduction, of course, you will have to consider some of the key scenarios, and one of them, if you can remember, is the baseline scenario, whereby we mentioned that this one basically is the situation that was existing before or prior the implementation of a project. In this case, let's say, for example, in the baseline, let's say for instance, a household is using, the three-stone, a three-stone cooking device. That is what, let's say, they've been using to cook their daily meals and all that. So that would be what we'll be considering it as a baseline scenario in this case. Yeah, and then going ahead now to understanding some key things, because again, remember, when you be understanding, if you just think about how we mentioned or how we define the business scenario as a whole scenario happening on the baseline, or in the time before, prior the implementation of a project. This section, for instance, of the emission reduction calculations, there are key different parameters that will be considered in this case. And of course, one of them would be the baseline emissions, like what are the emissions sort of occurring in the baseline setup. Yeah. For instance, like if you are if in the baseline they're using, let's say, the three-stone, the firewood, or let's say charcoal, what are the emissions on that specific setup or that specific scenario? And of course, that involves a lot of different parameters to be considered. And of course, being provided, as mentioned, that each methodology has its own clear guideline. Therefore, for these specific parameters that I'll be taking you through, they have been provided by this methodology, of course. And if you realize that for each methodology, they have their key specific approach on how they do their calculation of the emission reduction. And in this case, I'll be using two scenarios. That is using the two methodologies. That is a TPDD tech and the MECD for the metered projects. Therefore, the key nuances, of course, and the differences, as I'll be talking about in the next section. And of course, as also my colleague mentioned earlier, that for metered, for instance, the key difference, for instance, if you mentioned like just a light example, is that, let's say, for metered method, of course, it involves, let's say, you doing the actual calculations or like the real-time monitoring of, let's say, things like, the project fuel consumed, yeah, the usage rate and all those other assets. But again, for the TPDD, involves a bit of different perspective of using like something like the baseline sampling and all that aspect. First, I'll be taking you through some of the key nuances on how each of these actually apply in terms of the emission reductions. And for this, if you allow me, of course, just starting with the TPDD tech, there are key different parameters, and of course they're unique based on different methodology in this case. For TPDD, of course, there are key things that will be required to understand in the baseline setup. That is a specific fuel consumption of a individual business technology. In this case, we mean for a given household, typical household, what is a specific consumption of, let's say the given business fuel, let's say they were using the firewood or charcoal, what is the specific consumption of that specific type of fuel per given day of a normal, operation or of a cooking setup in this case. Then again, they provide two aspects on that. Of course, there are different ways on how you actually go about, getting those parameters. And one of the key things is, let's say, you can use the actual what we call the KPT, that is a kitchen performance test, whereby you're running like sort of a test, yeah, of using at least taking the actual data on ground. Let's say on the business setup, you follow up like a setup. For instance, if they cook in day one, you sort of monitor the amount of fuel they're using at that setup, and then you take it at least for 3 days to actually assess, like for a given day, for this specific typical household of, let's say, specific number of people, or let's say it's a household of five people, and of course, what are the specific consumption of firewood or charcoal, or the specific type of baseline fuel they're actually using in this case. And again, there is that way, that is using the kitchen performance. And of course, there is another provision of using what we call the default values. Again, these specific methodologies, each of them, of course, allow or provide a specific default value that you can utilize whenever, let's say, for instance, you're unable to perform this kitchen this kitchen performance test, of course, or maybe monitor the actual consumption of a baseline technology in this case. Therefore, those are the two main aspects on how you can go about getting to understand the specific fuel consumption of an individual business technology. Then the other one is what called the net calorific value of a specific fuel. Of course, this has been provided by the IPCC, having, of course, done some specific scientific assessment. Of course, they have a key list of the specific NCV values of all of the different types of fuel in this case. And of course, the other value will be, let's say, the emission factors. Of course, these will be very essential when we do be doing the calculation, because, for instance, let's say they evaluate, for instance, for a given, let's say, typical type of fuel using the baseline, what will be, for instance, the emissions, per given unit of fuel used in the baseline. So it is, again, another key specific parameter that is going to be utilized when we be doing the baseline emission calculation. And again, this has been provided, of course, in different regions, of course, and by the IPCCs as some of the default values to sort of make it at least easier for project developers when you'll be doing or providing a clear or sort of to promote the accuracy aspect in the calculations of the emission reductions. Of course, on the other hand, there is the metered methodology, as I mentioned. It provides it involves, of course, a lot of, let's say, different, baseline parameters setup, and one of them includes the amount of, baseline fuel. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, let's say there's a provision of, using again the kitchen performance test. There's a TPDD tech as well, and or maybe doing the, or maybe utilizing the specific baseline values or the specific default values that they have provided in that specific methodology. Then the other one will be the energy efficiency of the baseline device. Again, as my colleague mentioned, of course, for most baseline devices, it's, of course, they range, fairly below 10% in terms of the efficiency. And of course, these will be provided again by on the specific methodology. Of course, they have a specific value. Of course, you can use for or as a default value in this case. Then the other one is the percentage of fuel types. Of course, utilize, for example, for a given household, maybe they might be utilizing, let's say, more than one fuel in this case. Let's say they might be utilizing, the charcoal, and of course, and even the fire, of course. So they, of course, you have to understand or provide sort of a set of or maybe monitor what is, for instance, the percentage of fuel usage for this key different business fuels in this case. Then the other one, as I mentioned, is a net calorific value. Of course, I will not repeat that. And of course, the emission factor provide, of course, being provided by the IPCC as default value. Therefore, that makes it a bit easier or straightforward when it comes to the calculations. That is it for the baseline emission calculation. Of course, those are the specifics that you should be considering, of course, when you're doing the baseline emission reduction. Then remember, when you'll be doing a whole emission reduction calculation, it involves understanding what were the emissions that were occurring prior the project implementation. And of course, after you provide now, let's say, your project device, let's say they were using, in the business, they're using the 3-stone, and there's, of course, you provided a better or a cleaner cooking device. Let's say you provided an LPG stove to them. Of course, there is a bit of, let's say, emissions that are occurring in the baseline, but of course, even in the project, there is a bit of reduction because in your project, of course, it's not really emitting as a baseline, but of course, you're emitting a bit of the emission. Therefore, we will have also to consider or calculate, of course, what are some of these small emissions that your project device is emitting. Yeah. So besides you doing the change of, let's say, transitioning them to a cleaner fuel, of course, as the word mentions, it's cleaner. It's not completely clean. So there will be some fuel, let's say, you can consider or use that are not really, let's say, they're not emitting zero emission. Therefore, we'll have to consider the aspect of project emission in this case. And again, there is, of course, a provision or a typical, as my colleague mentioned, that there is typical requirements for the project device. They said, let's say, for instance, the technology should have at least, let's say, for different registers or for different methodologies. For instance, for the TPD tech, they provide at least to have an efficiency of 20% and above. Of course, for the MECD, they provide provision of, let's say, it should have at least 40% efficiency. So those are some of the key nuances you should, of course, think or focus through using these. And of course, there will be other mentions like, let's say, of course, what will be the fuel type of the technology, of the new technology. Of course, let's say, is it using the renewable biomass? Of course, is it using the LPG? All those nuances have to be considered in the project scenario in this case. Of course, as we mentioned, the project scenario is a scenario after the implementation of your project. Yeah. So there'll be key other nuances like what is the fuel use, of course, and the other thing would be understanding what are, for instance, the key difference, for instance, between the baseline and the project emission? Because remember, we mentioned that baseline is the setup before the project. And then after the project, again, depending on the technology, they might be, of course, emitting a little bit of emission. But then, let's say for the case of let's say solar cooking devices, whereby they're considered as purely renewable, therefore there will be literally zero emission in the project scenario, and therefore that is normally neglected or assumed as zero in the project emission. But then for the cases of where you're using or utilizing a cleaner technology that is not completely clean, therefore we will be having to consider the project's emission in this case. And some of the key parameters I mentioned, of course, starting the TPDD tech would be, for instance, from your project device, after implementing your project case in this case, like what to be, of course, the quantity of fuel consumed in your project device in this case. Of course, understanding or doing sort of an analysis, for instance, what would be the difference between the fuel that was used in the basic. For instance, they mentioned, let's say you're using, they were using the baseline, the 3-stone device, and they were using, let's say, a typical household was using, let's say, 2 tons of firewood. But then after providing the new project device, of course, they are consuming way less, fuel, compared to the baseline, of course. So you need to understand what are, for instance, the quantity of fuel, of course, consumed in the baseline, of course, the quantity of fuel consumed in the project, and of course, have an understanding, a clear understanding of what is the specific fuel savings because of or that has been impacted by your project device or your project scenario in this. That brings us to the next parameter called the specific fuel savings, which is basically the difference between the baseline fuel consumption and the project fuel consumption. Then the other one is the usage rate, for instance, like after the implementation of a project, like for instance, like what is the typical usage rate of that specific technology for that specific household. And again, remember, most households, of course, they would not really sort of transition. They might, be using your technology, but of course, there will be slight bit of, maybe using of maybe a bit of other technology compared to yours. Of course, therefore, you have to understand, for instance, what will be the usage rate of your specific technology device for that typical household. Again, that has to be monitored, and of course, being provided as a percentage of the total usage for this typical household. And of course, there is typical provisions or requirements whereby I will classify it. Of course, I'll show you the typical classification, of course, of what is the mandatory requirement in terms of the usage rate of our technology, and of course, what is maybe considered as a good usage rate, and what is like a way, perfect usage rate in this case. And of course, the other parameter would be, of course, the number of project technology days. And this translates to, for instance, for a given project device or a given household, like for how many, for instance, days are they utilizing this specific project technology in this case. Then the other key value will be the FNRB, that is a fraction of non-renewable biomass, which of course translates to, for instance, what let's say for a given, let's say, specific project boundary, what is the non-renewability of the biomass. For instance, this translates to, let's say, the rate in which, for instance, the biomass, for instance, let's say the harvest or the use or the use of the biomass, the non-renewable biomass, vis-a-vis the rate in which this biomass is actually regenerating or growing in this case. Therefore, that will be considered as, or the difference will be considered as the fraction of the renewable biomass in this case. Then the other case would be the leakage, as we mentioned, for instance, that this, in simple terms, if I would explain, is that once, remember, there was a baseline device, let's say, that was utilized in a specific household, and then you have provided your specific or typical project device. But then the baseline device, if in any case that device is transferred to another location, that will be considered as a leakage, and of course has to be subtracted from the main calculations of your emission reductions. Then moving to the MECD, again, a key differences, of course, as we mentioned, that this involves the direct, monitoring or calculation, or the direct monitoring of the, the project device. Of course, involves, let's say, things like, the amount of energy used by the project device, and of course, the thermal efficiency of the project device, and some of these key ones, of course, are provided, let's say, by the manufacturer information. Of course, there will be a key or a clear, of course, to be, of course, benchmarked by the requirement provided, let's say, to meet the 40% efficiency of the device. And of course, I'll not repeat about the FNRB value, and of course, the emission factors of this key specific, specific fuel that you're going to be using in your technology. Remember, depending on each technology you're going to be utilizing, you will have to, there is different varieties or different emission factors for each of the types of fuel you're going to be using. So let's say, for instance, your project is going to be utilizing electricity, and of course, this electricity, for instance, is coming from the grid, and of course, the grid is not entirely clean. Yeah. So there is a bit of electricity generated from from either fossil fuels or any other unclean fuels. Therefore, there will be a bit of the emissions from the electricity that your device, because therefore there is specific emission factors for each of the different types of fuels that you'll be considering in your project case in this case. And of course, the other thing is the leakage. Of course, I think I mentioned about this. And of course, it promotes, or it involves, the transfer of emissions from one project location to another project location in this case. If you will just allow me to dive in, as I mentioned earlier, is that there is a key, each method has its own key approach on how they do calculate the emission reductions. And of course, you realize, for instance, this, as you can see in the screen, this is a typical equation provided by this provided by the TPDD tech. And of course, each of them have their own approach on how they do the calculation. Therefore, they have provided, let's say, the key specifics on how, or the key, how do you call it, the key equation, how you will be going about calculating your emission reduction. Of course, remember, I've taken you through about the key parameters. And of course, once you have those values, of course, it's just like, inserting them in this specific emission, reduction equation. And of course, this Gold Standard has actually gone ahead and developed some interesting tools to be used. And of course, this includes they're called the emission reduction calculation tools, whereby, like, for the TPDD tech and the MECD methodology, there is a clear or a provided tool whereby it's an Excel sheet that provides or has like inbuilt calculation or formulation on how to calculate the emission reduction. And of course, all you do in the tool is just like, of course, inserting some of the values for this, specific parameters that I mentioned earlier. And of course, the tool will be able to calculate or equate for you the total emission reductions achieved by your specific project. Of course, this involves a lot of scenarios, as I mentioned, from the baseline fuel using, the technology, of course, the efficiency of the baseline device and the project device, of course, and even, let's say, the cleanliness of your fuel or the fuel used in the project scenario. And of course, that said, I'll pose again another question, for instance, like, how does a project developer, for instance, establish a baseline and a project scenarios in this case? Again, as I mentioned, that I've given you a bit of an understanding of what is a baseline scenario and what happens there in the project scenario. And of course, how like, just to get an understanding of on your side, is like, how does a project developer, for instance, establish some of these key baseline and project scenarios in this case? Yeah. As of course, just to, let me save a bit of this on you, of course. The key thing that happens in this case, of course, remember I mentioned that there is a bit of primary data collection, whereby, at least, let's say, there is things like the KPT, whereby you have to collect a bit of data from ground to understand, let's say, the nuances, like, the amount of, firewood or maybe the baseline fuel they're actually consuming. So that will be involving a bit of primary data collection that is on ground by the project developer, or maybe a third party, or use a recent published data. So there is a bit of options that you can have. And of course, as I mentioned, of course, it involves, you can utilize the baseline or the baseline collection, that is actual calculation or actual monitoring, or use published data, or even use the default values provided by each or by these specific methodologies in this case. The other case would be, for instance, for, like, just to bring all that up, like, those are the main options or to be considered when you be doing or to establish the design and project scenario. I think that is the key nuances on how you go about the key calculation on the emission reductions. And basically, just to give you like a wrap up, is understanding the emissions that are actually occurring in the baseline, then of course subtracting from the emissions occurring after you have implemented your project as a project scenario. And the key difference, of course, again, subtracting the leakage emissions, whereby for those little emissions that have been actually transferred from the project boundary to another boundary, and then the difference becomes your total emission reduction, or of course will be taken up as of course the total carbon credits in this case. And I think that would be it for this section. Of course, I will allow take it back first to my colleague to take us through the next section, that is on the eligibility, applicability, and additionality, to reflect back even on the specific key things that are mentioned on the key nuances and differences between each of these methodologies, and actually how you go about to utilize, or how you go about to select a specific methodology in this case. Back to you, Charles.
Thank you so much for that, Zach. I will now proceed to the third module, and I hope we are all together. I know at some point in time, we might feel that the concepts are slightly technical, but our intention is to just make sure we give a good basis or foundation to trigger your curiosity to further go and investigate or learn more about the nuances around developing specific climate mitigation projects. Now, the third module is very important. Like I've always mentioned that whereas you might see that things are very easy for you to get a so-called verified emissions reduction, it's always very important to make sure that you adhere to the specific guidelines. In that case, for this particular conversation, we are looking at to understand a number of items, and of course, how do we go about the eligibility requirements, the applicability requirements of the gold standard certification process. How do we demonstrate additionality with respect to clean cooking projects, and last but not least, just to make sure we are also on the same board on the concept of FNRB, that is fractional of non-renewable burners. For those who have been following clean cooking projects, there's been a lot that has been said about FNRB, and this section was actually included because of an update from the gold standard that came out actually yesterday with respect to how will FNRB be treated in the context of clean cooking projects moving forward. And we felt it's important to make sure that we provide that update for developers who are yet to come across the notification. Now, clean cooking project might appear to be simple, but in all honesty, they are slightly complex if you consider the various moving parts within it. Now, as a developer, it might be very easy for you to find the best marketing and distribution strategy to put across or to share your devices, but that is not it. That will only solve the problem of making sure you get your return on investment from selling of the cook stove. But when it comes to making sure that such cook stoves can get what we call carbon finance, there are a number of items that you must make sure you have been able to figure out. Just a quick recap is the technology. Remember, we have talked about the efficiency, and without the efficiency, you cannot make the emissions reduction. So if somebody was emitting, let's say, 5 tons of greenhouse gases when they were using the 3-stone and firewood stoves, then you must ensure you're introducing a very efficient cooking technology that can at least be able to reduce it by 20% if you'll be using the TPDD tech, or 40% if you're going to be using the MECD methodologies. But of course, the more you can reduce, the higher the efficiency, the better it is. And then you must make sure that your project is going to be eligible within the given standards of the carbon registry. And of course, eligibility speaks to you following the standard documents you have been talking about. And then there's applicability. You might find that a cook stove project or a clean cooking project might be applicable, let's say, using the TPDD tech, but not be applicable using the MECD methodology under the gold standard, because again, you need to look at the requirements for each methodology against what you are doing. Then there are the monitoring requirements. For example, there's a key distinction as shown by Zach between using the TPDD tech compared to MECD. For example, the latter, that is the measured and metered energy cooking devices, requires you to make sure that every cook stove has a meter embedded within it if you intend to use that particular methodology. If not, then your best bet will be using the TPDD tech. But also remember, when it comes to selling your credits, every buyer, every investor wants to make sure that they are going to be buying credits that are easily verifiable. And the only way to make sure your credits are easily verifiable is by the use of such digitally enabled monitoring reporting capacities. Additionality, surveillance mentioned, is very important. If, for example, you're able to distribute your cook stoves without the need for carbon finance, then if the investment analysis is showing that you don't really need carbon credits, then indeed you will not be registered. And therefore, additionality is very important and should be looking at this in greater detail. The monitoring requirements, every methodology clearly stipulates the monitoring parameters. If you just click the links given to the two methodologies, that is the TPDD Tech and MECD in the chart, you will see there's a particular chapter that speaks to the monitoring requirements, and that is something you have to make sure you are fully adhered to for you to have a successfully developed clean cooking project. Community engagement is important, like I've mentioned. People are used, for example, using cooking vessels of a diameter of 30 centimeters, but yet you're deploying a cook stove whose diameter, the burner is, let's say, 5 centimeters in diameter. It might not really be useful for such African setups. So you have to make sure that you talk to the community, understand their needs before you're giving them a replacement. And then remember, maintenance and repairs is very important. If, for example, as you all know, the crediting period for climate mitigation projects and the gold standard is 5 years, it then follows that you must make sure that your cooking technology, or rather your cooking vessel that you're distributing, is able to outlast that crediting period. And when it breaks down, you have provided adequate approaches towards making sure you can provide maintenance and repair services. If your device will only have a lifespan of 2 years, yet you're asking for a crediting period of 5 years, chances are the auditor will not clear your project because your device does not speak to the vision and mission and overall targets that you're trying to achieve in climate mitigation projects. So it's very important that you make sure your cooking apparatus that you're introducing is able to outlast the crediting period, in this case 5 years. Of course, it's renewable twice, but at least we can focus on the first crediting period of 5 years. You must make sure that your device can outlast that. Most of, let's say, the electric cooking devices are able to outlast that crediting period. What's now important for them is to make sure they've developed appropriate maintenance and repair frameworks to make sure that people who are using the devices and they break down are able to receive maintenance and repair services in the most cost-effective manner to ensure they do not revert back to their business as usual behavior. That is, let's say, using charcoal or firewood. That is very, very important. Please feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat and we shall revert on the same. The last and most important key thing we also want to make sure we give over is based on the updates given on the fraction of non-renewable biomass. As Zach mentioned, it's one of the key parameters that is covered when you're looking at the project scenario. The fraction of non-renewable biomass, FNRB, key thing there is non-renewable biomass is a very pivotal metric in clean cooking projects, particularly those seeking carbon credits or, if you like, emissions reduction. It quantifies the portion of biomass, such as, let's say, wood or charcoal, harvested at rates exceeding the natural regeneration capacity of the particular landscape. Okay, we are looking at the ratio between that which is being harvested for, let's say, cooking compared to that which is being regenerated. Now, you will notice that in areas, communities, regions where there's significant use of firewood harvested from forest, in this case, you'll find that the ratio between harvesting and regeneration is exceedingly high, meaning that in such kind of ecosystems, then the use of the introduction of a highly efficient clean cooking project will be of great benefit to such communities. However, if you're doing a cook stove project in a community whereby if you look at the forestry landscape, the ratio between that which has been harvested against what is being regenerated is little, it simply means that not that many people are using firewood for cooking, and therefore your supposed or proposed mitigation activity might not give you the desired impact with respect to emissions reduction compared to a community where there's more of deforestation compared to natural regeneration. In essence, FNRB assesses how much of the biomass used in a sustainable is unsustainable, leading to deforestation and increased carbon emissions, or if you like, GHG emissions reduction. In many regions, especially in the global south or low and middle income countries, most households, have mentioned, heavily rely on biomass, or if you like, non-renewable biomass for cooking. When this biomass is harvested unsustainably, it contributes to deforestation and greenhouse gas emission. That said, clean cooking interventions such as improve cook stoves or clean cook stove projects aim to reduce biomass consumption. The effectiveness of these interventions in mitigating emissions is directly linked to now what we call the FNRB. Remember at the very beginning, I asked a very important question. What is the underlying principle in developing a clean cooking project? One of the key things we are trying to intervene is to mitigate the use of non-renewable biomass within our communities. In other words, it will make no economic sense in deploying a clean cooking project in an ecosystem whereby the amount of natural regeneration exceeds that which is being harvested, because that is the problem we are really trying to cure over and above things to do with indoor air pollution. But suffice to say that if you have your FNRB value is, let's say, 0.1, for example, it simply means that not that many households are using firewood or charcoal for cooking, and therefore even the presumed indoor air pollution might not be that big of a problem compared to an ecosystem where the FNRB value is, let's say, 0.9 or 90%, because in that case, it simply means that there's a lot of a consumption of firewood for use of harvesting of trees and whatnot for firewood and charcoal production. Now, that said, accurate FNRB assessments are crucial for ensuring the integrity of emissions reduction claimed by clean cooking projects. Overestimating such value, that is FNRB, can lead to inflated emissions reduction claim, undermining the credibility of the carbon market ecosystem. It is because of this reason that the gold standard has been reviewing the concept of FNRB, and yesterday they issued some updates and guidelines. So in order to ensure the gold standard projects remain at the forefront of integrity and aligned with the latest norms and science, from 30th of June of this year, the Clean Development Mechanism, that is a CDM Tool 30, will no longer be eligible for new projects. And from 31st December of this year, all FNRB values previously applied in design certified projects will be deemed to have expired and therefore void. Currently, people have been using CDM Tool 30 to get FNRB values, and that will come to an end by mid of this year, because the gold standard is very keen to clean up some of these overestimations of FNRB values. So before these dates, the project developers have the flexibility to either maintain existing values or update those values using one of the various approaches that have been prescribed. For those of you in the ecosystem, you might be familiar with MOFOS, that is modeling fuel wood saving scenario. I'll ask my colleagues to type that in the chat and also give the link to MOFOS, that is modeling fuel wood saving scenarios. If you are a developer that you're looking to set up a clean cooking project, it is very highly recommended that you consider using the MOFOS tool to calculate your FNRB values. CDM Tool 33 as well has been said to be applicable. And they also mentioned that the Article 6.4 framework is going to be providing further guidelines with respect to FNRB. So this is something very important, and it's an important guideline for those who are going to be going into the clean cooking carbon projects for you to put into consideration, please visit the website if you want more guidelines or details on the same. Remember, we also discussed earlier on the different tools, and as you said, the principles and requirements tool is going to be very important. The community service agreements tool is also going to be very, very important. And we also noted that with the context of clean cooking projects within the gold standard, there are a number of methodologies applicable, each of which has its own nuances. We talked about the TPDD tech methodology. We talked about the MAECD methodology. You use the TPDD tech for, let's say, you're still using fire or charcoal. You use MAECD if your cook stove has a meter. If your project is a micro-scale project, of course, you'll be using the simplified gold standard methodology. And yes, those are some of the available methodologies. And remember, you must make sure your project is developed in compliance with the respective guidelines, especially on stakeholder engagement, safeguarding principles, and gender equality. That said, please feel free to type out this answer in the chat box. What gold standard documents are mandatory for clean cooking projects? What gold standard documents are mandatory for clean cooking projects? Remember, again, as a developer, these documents are things that you must make sure you're very familiar with. They're available on the website, but also make sure we put in links in the chat box for you guys to have a quick look at it. As I said, the key documents are the principle and requirements document. In this case, you're looking at principles and requirements, stakeholder guidelines, safeguarding requirements, and the gender equality guidelines. And also, we have got the community service activity requirements, methodologies, and the GS product requirements. Last question, and this should be a discussion question for you guys. So again, put your answers in the chat box. What happens if a project does not meet the necessary requirements? What do you think is likely to happen if a project is found not to meet at least or any one of these requirements? What is likely to be the outcome? Please put your comments there, or your thinking, and we'll be able to respond to any that is not aligned to what is likely to be the scenario. Now, we have spoken about additionality from the beginning of our courses, and additionality is very important for any carbon project. Now, as a developer, you must make sure you read the community service activity requirements, the CSAR, and you must make sure that you have not only read those guidelines, and you must also make sure as a developer you have demonstrated in your feasibility report and the PDD, applicable, that you have indeed developed your project within the community service activity requirements procedure. Now, key thing to note here is that the CSR, that is the community service activity requirements, includes a section on demonstrating additionality. As a developer, if your project meets the requirements, then you do not have to apply the CDM 201. Okay, remember that. If you are able to demonstrate that you have met the additionality requirements in the community service activity requirements document, as a developer, you do not then need to go and use the CDM tool. However, as we said in our previous webinars, sometimes investors or buyers of credits requires you to go above and beyond and demonstrate why the project is deemed or should be considered to be additional. So in this case, the community service activity requirement provides a criteria where projects are deemed to be additional, and where research will not be required to prove additionality at the design certification. Okay, and of course, you must be able to make sure that you're able to show this. So, who or what are some of the conditions that will show you are not required to demonstrate additionality? Number one, as you can see there on your screen, if you're in the positive list. Positive list is an important list because it says it shows that, for example, if your project is going to be deployed in, let's say, in institutions, and it's going to be able to reduce emissions by, let's say, 600, then automatically you're deemed to be additional because of the small scale in nature. If your project is located in least developed countries, small island and developing states, or whatnot, then also you're automatically deemed to be additional. Microscale project, that is projects that are found to be less than 10, reducing less than 10,000 tons of greenhouse gases, then those are also deemed to have been deemed to be macro-scale project and therefore automatically be additional. And of course, another way you can demonstrate additionality is by using the UNFCCC CDM tool 01, but this is only for the case whereby you want to go above and beyond to show a potential developer or a potential investor that indeed you have gone above and beyond to demonstrate additionality. So what is this CDM tool 01? For the benefit of those who have not been with us, for those who have been with us, please bear with me. But CDM tool 01 for demonstration of additionality has a number of steps, and the steps should be applied what we call stepwise. Meaning, you start by one step. If you need additionality, you can stop there. But if you don't need additionality, then you go to the next step. And if you come to the very last step and you still deem not to be additional, then that is it. If you have not been able to demonstrate additionality using the community service activity requirements and you're not able to demonstrate additionality using CDM 201, then that is where the ambition of getting your carbon project registered comes to an end. So step 0 is always demonstrating whether the proposed project activity is the first of its kind. Chances are, if you're doing a clean books of projects, it's not going to be the first of its kind, because not unless within your project model there's no other such project or such novelty, then you can be able to achieve additionality by demonstrating step 0. If not, it is okay. That is not the end of your project. You then go to step 1. Step 1 being identification of alternatives to the project activity. What is the other alternative that might be available to the people who are using, let's say, 3-stone and firewood for cooking? Is there any other alternative to your project activity that can be considered? Okay, if the answer is no, there's no alternative, then you have to proceed to step number 2, and this is what you call the investment analysis. Now, for persons who will be looking to do an Article 6 project in the clean cooking sector, investment analysis is absolutely important, whether or not you're able to meet the community service activity requirement. It does not matter. Investment analysis will be very important for you if you're looking at doing an Article 6 project, because investment analysis simply asks, can it be proven through a financial model or an investment analysis that absence of carbon credits, you will not be able to do a mitigation project? That is the question. Do you absolutely need carbon finance to do your mitigation activity? If the answer is yes, then you'll be approved to have you have proven additionality by way of investment analysis. However, if an investment analysis is done and it's found that you actually don't need carbon finance, and therefore you're not able to prove additionality by step 2, then you have the option still to go to step number 3, which is barrier analysis. For example, you might have all the implementation finances, but maybe the people in the boundary you're trying to support in the mitigation activity, they have a natural dislike for, let's say, the use of LPG or electric cooking. So there is a cultural barrier. Maybe for them, there's a cultural thing with cooking with firewood, maybe, for example. If that can be documented and proven, then you can say, hey, we have proven additionality by way of barrier analysis, whereby there's a cultural practice within this particular community in this boundary that they do not like to cook with anything other than firewood. And therefore, I need carbon finance so that I can raise adequate finances to deploy a behavioral change strategy to convince people to stop using trees for firewood, and let's say they start using LPG or biogas or electricity for that matter. If, however, you're not able to prove additionality by way of barrier analysis, your last bet is common practice analysis. Now, common practice analysis is very simple. The question is, what is the common cooking practice of your project boundary? If you have to do a baseline study and look at a national survey of, let's say, a given country, let's say your country is, let's say, Malawi, how many people in your country cook with firewood as opposed to, let's say, LPG, electricity, or even ethanol? if you can show that like significant number of people, like over 90% of the people within the given boundary are accustomed to using firewood for cooking, then you have also proven additionality by way of common practice analysis. If, however, you are still unable to demonstrate additionality by step 4, then you are unable to demonstrate additionality by OCDM 201. And if you're also unable to demonstrate additionality by way of the community service activity requirements, then you have not been able to prove additionality, and therefore your project will not be eligible. I hope that point is very, very clear. So eligibility speaks to the guidelines of the project. Then you've got applicability that speaks to the suitability of a project to rely on one or two of the respective methodologies. We have focused on these two methodologies because they're the ones which are considered to be the most robust for the gold standard. You have got your TP DD Tech and you have got your MMECD. You will excuse us for the abbreviations. It's something very common in the ecosystem. But just to remind you, TPDDTEC stands for Technologies and Practices to Displace Decentralized Thermal Energy Consumption. And that particular methodology has been provided for you as a link in the chat. MMECD stands for Measured and Metered Energy Cooking Devices. As you can see, there are two quick differences, four key differences, whereby TPD Tech will be used whereby looking at deploying an improved biomass cookstove project, and it could also be a solar cooker, will be applicable there. But if you're looking at electric stoves, electric pressure cookers, LPG, burgers, and these devices are metered, including even a solar cooking device, then you'll be using the MMCD. If the cooking device has a thermal efficiency of about 20%, then you'll be using TPDD Tech. If you're using one that is about 40%, or there's a way in which you can measure the energy of fuel consumed, then you'll be looking at using the MMECD methodology. Now, if you're able to show evidence that indoor air pollution levels are also not that considerate, then you'll be able to use the TPDD Tech. And of course, for you to use the MMCD methodology and it's metered, you must be able to show that the cooking device that you're introducing can easily demonstrate a level of thermal energy efficiency improvement. So for example, maybe your cook stove is like 60% thermally efficient, for example, that would be one such kind of an approach. I hope that point is very, very clear. But of course, we're happy to share any technical guidelines for anyone who has a question. Just drop us a question in the comment section, or if you've got project specific question, please feel free to drop us your question. I want you guys to give me answers in the chat box. What is the principle of additionality? Okay, what is the basic principle of additionality? Why must we be adhering to additionality? Now, I will not reiterate too much on the model requirements because Zach was very able to really share this when you're looking at the baseline parameters and the project parameters. And as a developer, when you have developed your project in line with the given methodological requirements, you must make sure that you're able to tick some of the right boxes. For example, things like transfer of carbon rights. Remember that developers will be working with manufacturers who are now manufacturing, and then you guys are distributing these stoves to the community. You need to make sure you've spoken to the communities and tell them that they individually as a household cannot develop a carbon project, and therefore they need to waive their rights. If they don't waive their rights, still they'll not be eligible. Because remember, as we mentioned, guys, that carbon credits or emissions reductions goes to the owner of the intellectual property that does the mitigation, and in this case it belongs to the manufacturer of the cookstoves. However, certain methodologies like the one like MMCD talks about incentivized mechanisms, whereby in as much as you'll be asking a household to waive its carbon rights to the cook stove, you are going to find a way in which you're going to be able to share those benefits. One way you can share the benefits could be a subsidy to the cook stoves. Maybe when you manufacture the cook stove, it's going to be as high as $60, but because of carbon finance, you're able to bring down that price to about $20. That is one such way in which you can look at it. Things like the baseline study, you must be able to make sure you have done a baseline study that speaks to the project boundary you're dealing with. You must make sure you've got a well-deployed annual monitoring plan set in place that is responding to the guidelines given in the respective methodology. If you look at the monitoring guidelines for TPDD Tech, you'll find they're very unique and slightly different to the ones by MMCD. So you have to look at the methodology and look at the section that deals with the monitoring plan. You must also be able to make sure that regardless of which methodology you're using, you have a way in which you can measure the fuel consumption in this context. And of course, you must be able to make sure that when you are deploying your cook stove, people are using your cook stoves throughout. And the only way that will be making sense or possible is if your cook stove has the right utilities. Is it actually being a good replacement of is it a good replacement of what they're currently using in the household? Without that, then they'll only be viewing your cook stove as a novelty item and not something that can easily be replacing theirs. And also you have to be making sure you're able to monitor the drop-off rates. For example, yes, people like your stuff, but maybe for one reason or the other, they're not able to be using your stoves throughout. That's something very important. And I think you can remember within the project parameters, those are some of the things that are often calculated. And of course, most importantly, if you're able to digitally monitor your device usage, then that will be most welcome. And remember, it never hurts if you can go above and beyond the basic requirements given by the gold standard, because the more you can do, the better it is, and it will speak to your project. That said, allow me to stop there and invite Zach to come and wrap up with the fourth module, and hopefully we can close up today's session by 11. Otherwise, the recording will be available on my YouTube channel, and we have also shared with you a link in the chat that shows all the different notes, PowerPoint presentation, and PDFs for all the topics from the first topic. And by the end of today's session, this will also be added to that Google Drive link for you to be able to download. Others, let me stop there for now and invite Zach to conclude in the last module.
Thanks a lot for a very engaging session. So I'm going to be taking you through the last, just a moment to share my screen. Yes. Hope you can see the screen. Yes. So this is again, as we mentioned, that it's going to be the last module. Of course, this a bit of it involves a lot of things that we actually discussed, and just be like going through, like skimming through, using very minimal time possible. And basically, in this module, we're going to be focusing on the implementation and monitoring and reporting and verification plan. And of course, at the end of the session, we'll be looking forward to help you understand what are some of the requirements of monitoring requirements for a carbon project, that is for the clean cooking project. And then, for instance, how making you understand the concept of the kitchen performance test. I'll give a little bit of a basic understanding of it, but of course now I'll be a little bit in depth to help you understand in depth how that concept actually works, and then the gold standard usage rate guidelines as well. So if you allow me to go ahead and straight ahead, so I'll start with the first methodology, that is TPDD Tech. Of course, as I mentioned, for instance, there is remember, as mentioned, that when you be conducting, for instance, there are key different parameters that you'll be focusing on when you're doing the monitoring, and one of them is included in the baseline scenario. Remember, we mentioned that when we'll be doing the baseline calculations, there will be a requirement to at least understand what is the setup of the baseline situation, things like the consumption of the baseline fuel, like, if they are using the typical, 3 stones cook stove, let's say using, let's say, firewood or charcoal, what is the specific consumption of, the firewood at that given scenario in this case. Of course, that involves processes like, kitchen performance tests, which includes a bit of process and guidelines. And of course, I will be showing you or guiding you through the specifics on how that actually is done. And then there is other aspect of baseline survey. This is whereby you do or conduct like a typical survey to understand some of the key nuances of the practices, on ground, in the baseline setup in this case. Of course, this involves a lot of, let's say, typical structured questions, or like typical survey to understand the basic or the cooking technology of fuel, or cooking technologies, and even the practices for on a given baseline setup. Then the other one will be the usage. That is a project survey. This includes, again, after you've understood, let's say, the baseline setup or the understanding on the practices of all the technology that actually used in the baseline setup. Again, that again will be duplicated again in the project scenario, whereby you will have again to do another survey to understand the key nuances of the practices or the trends on the technology after the implementation of your project. And then the other key thing will be the usage rate guidelines. Of course, I'll be taking you through at least to understand what are some of the key nuances or guidelines provided by this by the gold standard registry on the usage rate specific in this case. And of course, this involves like the usage of a specific project device in a given or typical household compared to other technologies or devices in this case. Then there's something I'll be talking about, the continuous stove, monitors. Of course, this is basically like we mentioned in the MECD, whereby you doing a typical, continuous monitoring to sort of reflect at least an accurate data monitoring or collection in this case. And of course, this is, if you understand that this is actually duplicated in even other methodologies. So the requirements or monitoring requirements for different would be sort of typical, almost the same. So this is actually duplicated or have sort of similar concept even for the other methodologies. But of course, I was just giving, of course, using these as an example or a guideline, that is a TPDD tech. So diving through to the first topic, that is on the kitchen performance test. I think, as I mentioned earlier, that this involves like the typical, and this is actually done in 2 scenarios. Yeah, remember, there is a baseline scenario, aspect, and of course there's a project scenario aspect, whereby this is done in those 2 scenarios. And of course, later for the baseline, as I mentioned, is like it's typically doing like an actual test. Yeah, let's say go into a typical household and record, let's say, the actual fuel consumption for 3, let's say, consecutive days, and record that and take an average to get like the total, like, for instance, to get an overview on, maybe, for instance, what is the actual consumption of specific fuel in the baseline setup in a typical house. And then the same case applies for the project scenario, whereby it is again conducted. Let's say you do again another test, whereby you're collecting data, let's say, from typical household, and that includes, for instance, for a given specific fuel. Let's say they're using, let's say, an electricity stove, or let's say it's an improved cook stove, for instance. Yeah, so it is, yes, consuming fuel, but then it's a bit less fuel compared to the baseline fuel. So it is going to be like, again, how it's conducted is like you do again another test, whereby you conduct, let's say, a test to understand, like, to actually monitor the, let's say, the amount of, let's say, firewood or fuel, specific fuel consumed by that project technology by a given day. And of course, this is done for a bit of at least 3 consecutive days. And of course, you can get an average to get the actual consumption of the project technology. And of course, this is going to be used now to drive or to derive down the value we mentioned about the specific fuel savings, which of course includes the the difference between the baseline fuel consumed and the project fuel consumed in this case. Moving to the next section will be on the design and the project surveys. Of course, this includes, of course, capturing some of the key nuances in terms of the current practices, in the baseline setup, and even, let's say, understanding or capturing some of the key nuances or data points in the project setup again. So remember, when you be doing, for instance, the baseline setup, for instance, on the baseline setup again, the approach, as I mentioned, even as the same as the KPT, they actually sort of do duplicate each other. So therefore, for instance, on the baseline aspect, you'll be like going at least to capture, the situation, of course, before the implementation of the project, and of course, understanding some of the capture some of the key nuances. For instance, what are some of the key details that like the fuel consumption is a typical most used fuel. Yeah, what is a trend on ground, basically just getting some basic understanding on the information on the project location or before the implementation of the project. Of course, for the project survey includes surveys, or maybe conducting again another survey now after the project is implemented to understand some of the key. For instance, let's say what are the random, at least to understand for a given technology, let's say what are some of the key project parameters or project values. Yeah, let's say, for instance, the fuel consumed in a given, and then let's say things like the usage rate, the patterns and all those things after the implementation of the project. So the key difference between the baseline and the project phase, of course, it depends on the scenario. Whereby the baseline is before the implementation of the project. Of course, the project is after the implementation of the project. Of course, there is some key requirement of provision on how you do the sampling for this case, because of course, let's say for the TBDD, as we mentioned, that those devices are not really they do not have a meter. Therefore, it is allowed or eligible to do what called a sampling. At least you take a random sample from the total project devices and do a collective survey on each of these cases. Therefore, there is a provision of by a registry like the CDM have like a good a whole comprehensive tool on how you can go about doing the sampling plan or setup in this case. And here I think I would pose again a straight head question whereby just to understand like what does a KPT measure in this case. Yeah, you can just again chime in the comment section just to show what, or at least for us to understand what you understand by this. So basically, just to give a highlight, of course, it quantifies or helps quantifying at least the fuel consumption at a typical household. Yeah, on a normal usage conditions for at least 3 given days. Yeah, then of course it helps to establish the baseline and the project fuel consumption setup, and even to understand or be and helping you to equate or quantify the total fuel savings of a given technology in this case. Yeah, then moving ahead to the usage rate. So I think this one, I think we mentioned, I've been trying to explain it in details. I think I will not really go deep again in it. Of course, it's trying to understand, of course, for a given typical household, what is the usage rate of the specific project device or project technology vis-a-vis the other technology actually utilized in a specific household. And of course, there is a key highlight, for instance, guidelines provided by the by the gold standard, of course, whereby there is a clear provision, let's say a mandatory, of course, let's say a usage rate of at least, for a given typical project, there should be at least a usage rate of 75%. Yeah, so this is provided as a guideline to all the carbon projects actually utilizing this specific methodology in this case. And of course, again, you can go ahead, of course, achieve a higher usage rate depending on the technology, and of course how you you impose, of course, or how maybe you incentivize the users to utilize your specific or your project device. Yeah, so of course it considered as a good practice at least to have for a higher than 75%. Of course, best practice is way above 90%. That is like, it's like completely the house would actually complete almost using your project technology for almost every cooking activity in that specific household. Then again, for that one, I would just pose as a specific question, like for instance, like how often do we conduct this survey or project, this specifically the baseline or project surveys? Yeah, so the key specific answer would be, of course, the baseline is conducted once before the project implementation. Remember, I mentioned that the baseline involves, just as the word mentioned, this is a situation or scenario before prior the implementation of project. Therefore, this is actually conducted once before the project implementation. Of course, now the difference between now that in the project survey, this is actually done on a given monitoring period. In this case, it's provided as annual survey conduct. At least, let's say for a given year, a given sampling is done to at least collect again a data on the consumption of or the usage rate, things like the usage rate, the consumption of the fuel in the project setup, and all those nuances. So that is actually done on an annual basis. So compared to the baseline, which is done once, but this one for the project is actually done on an annual basis for the entire crediting period of that specific project. Then on the next one will be on the metered, as we mentioned that I'm going to be taking it for two different cases. That is on TPD tech. And of course, the last one on the metered and measured method, that is the MECD. Of course, this one we mentioned the key identity, or for instance, the key unique specific or characteristic for this methodology is whereby this involves like a technology that actually has or a meter that is actually metering the actual energy or fuel used at a given or a given device. And again, this is actually done by each of the devices. Therefore, in this case, compared to the other, let's say the TPD whereby at least you devices are not really metered, but this one in this case for the metered, all devices in this case that are going to be utilized in the specific project has to be metered or have to monitor or measure the actual energy or fuel consumed in this case. And of course, this again depends on the specific technology you're using. Let's say if it's LPG, it's let's say the tangent or the kgs consumed, or if it's electricity, of course, like in terms of megawatts in this case. Yeah. Then this is, of course, as we mentioned, that the monitoring period of the monitoring sequence of this case compared. Remember the other one we shared is actually done on an annual basis, yeah. But now for the metered, it is like because it involves the direct measurement of the or metering the specific devices. This involves like a direct or continuous monitoring, yeah. So it is not necessarily like the other one, by at least you're doing, let's say, a survey at on an annual basis, but this one at least you're doing it on like or continuous. It's a continuous process, yeah. So because the device has a metering, of course, so we can be able to access let's say the consumption of let's say a given project device from our specific vicinities or offices in this case. Yes, so that one is as I mentioned, of course, at least I mentioned that I think I've explained mostly about how the the continuous monitoring actually done and what it really entails, and it's a very key thing, and that's a key unique specifics on this specific methodology in this case. So let's go about the monitoring plan. That is in this case, of course, this includes when you be doing, for instance, the whole project development. Of course, you have to put like there is again understanding of putting together how you're going to be going about doing some of this key monitoring and verification aspect for your project. So it has to be like of course you have to put together like put all these things together. Of course, like put a structured monitoring plan for these or for your specific given project. Of course, there are some of the key requirements or things to consider when you be thinking about this. Of course, this includes, let's say, each method, of course, has their own requirement. Yeah, as I mentioned, let's say there is a different, let's say, like the TPDD, which provides, let's say, an annual monitoring period. Of course, the other one has like it has to be like continuous. So you have to understand or consider, let's say, the specific methodology you're using. And then let's say what are the specific data that has to be collected in this case, and of course what are the specific sampling plan requirement for this case, let's say for the case of the TPDD tech. Yeah, so again, this is actually required, or at least to be able to capture all the required information, and at least to be able to follow up on the quality control of your data, and even at least to demonstrate a bit of the compliance, because again, as mentioned, there is a provision of the specific requirements on the monitoring plan in this. Therefore, this again provides a very clear way, at least to demonstrate your compliance to those specific requirements. Then again, the other thing would be the checking the functionality, at least to make sure that how you've structured the monitoring into the adherence of how the method has provided their approach in this case. Then the other one is providing sort of like an ongoing and engagement to understand some of the key nuances and trends of a given technology in the given period. Of course, the other thing would be, for instance, as we mentioned, it's a good thing to consider things like end user training, of course, to promote the usage rate. As we mentioned, that is a key requirement on the specific minimal usage rate. That is mandatory. That is a 70%. And of course, having like some of the user training to help the user at least understand on how to use the device or your technology is really, really important consideration in your monitoring plan in this case. And I think that would be it for this section. And at least we are 5 minutes out. So I think that would be it for the monitoring and plan. Of course, if you have any questions, again, as I mentioned, you can put them in the chat. Of course, we'll be happy to respond to those specific questions. But yeah, so that would be it for that. Charles.
Thank you so much, Zach, and I want to thank each and every single one of you for taking time to join us in this journey in trying to demystify the carbon market ecosystem. That said, I'm happy to say to report that we have uploaded all the notes to the Drive link, including today's session. So please feel free to click on the link there, and you'll be able to access all the notes from the first topic, that was introduction to carbon markets, to the very last topic, which is now today's clean cooking project. We really want to appreciate you taking time to listen to us, share your insights, and the ones also who are reaching out to us via email. We'll keep on making sure we respond to any unanswered question via email or even down the chat session. We intend to have these sessions on a quarterly basis. That said, expect another such similar initiative in the third quarter of this year. Of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, we as Verst Carbon we're still putting together what we call the Verst Carbon Academy. It's going to be an e-learning module that allows you to have a similar experience, slightly different, more engaging, but the difference being it's going to be, of course, be free as well, and it's going to be self-paced. You're going to be able to go through these different concepts at your own pace, at your own time. We're also doing another similar initiative with the Siemens Stiftung Foundation, and we're also going to be sharing more of that via social media channels, especially LinkedIn. So please make sure you follow us on LinkedIn for more of such updates. Otherwise, allow me to stop there, jump into another meeting, but I'm looking forward to hearing more of what you guys are doing, and thank you very much.